At Pepperdine, you'll not only see policy differently, you'll see your future differently from here too. Good evening, I'm Pete Peterson, Dean of Pepperdine School of Public Policy, bringing you greetings once again from the planet Malibu, a town which stands tonight as the polar opposite of Washington, D.C., and I mean polar in its geographic as well as figurative sense. Welcoming you to tonight's Moral Sense and Public Policy evening conversation with Rod Dreher and his new book, The Benedict Option. The title of this conversation series, in collaboration with the Trinity Foru, which now enters its 5th year, is derived from the crucial work of one of my school's founders and longtime professors, the late great political scientist, Dr. James Q. Wilson. It was Wilson who created our unique Great Books graduate policy curriculum, founded on the understanding that public leaders should be shaped by all the social science, not just the ones that supposedly measure things. We are also one of a handful of graduate policy programs in the United States based at a Christian university, which makes our co-hosting tonight's discussion particularly poignant and ironic. After all, it's our mission to educate and prepare students for careers in the public square, to pursue what we believe is a calling to public service. As we near our 20th anniversary this coming fall, we've sent hundreds of graduates to work in state and national capitals, including this town. And it's great to see so many of our alums here tonight. As a program that is particularly focused on preparing public leaders, a significant number of our graduates go on to run for public office at all levels. This includes, well, me. I graduated from the School of Public Policy over a decade ago, and the program directly led to my own campaign for statewide office in California 2 years ago. I ran as a Republican, which is why I stand before you tonight as the Dean of Pepperdine School of Public Policy. It's okay, I'm getting over it. I did not take the Benedict Option, apparently. But in an increasingly secularized America, how should people of faith, like me, like many of you, engage politically and culturally? These are the vital questions we are about wrestling with tonight. And Rod Dreher has certainly put a stake in the ground or a line in the Malibu sand. And who better to co-host such a conversation than the Trinity Foru, our partner for these last 5 years? In obvious ways, there's not a lot of overlap in the Venn diagram between Malibu and Washington, D.C., but in that small sliver of space of commonality, you'll see Pepperdine School of Public Policy and the Trinity Foru, two organizations exploring the call to public service and public leadership. So thanks for braving these incredibly difficult elements tonight, and please welcome my friend Trinity Foru's President, Cherie Harder, to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pete, for that always gracious introduction. And welcome to all of you to tonight's evening conversation with Rod Dreher on the Benedict Option, a strategy for Christians in a post-Christian nation. As Pete noted, this has been part of an ongoing partnership that the Trinity Foru has had with the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. And over the past 5 years, we've tackled a number of topics, including the strange persistence of guilt in a post-religious world, the friendship and war experience of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and how it changed their moral imagination, and through that, the literary landscape. We've talked about the link between injustice and poverty and how to break it, understanding the link between authority and vulnerability, the surprising story of the character formation of Ulysses S. Grant and the role of faith in his leadership. And tonight, we're going to grapple together with how to rethink the wisest means of Christian public engagement in the midst of significant political and cultural shifts, as well as new internal challenges, both to the orthodoxy and vibrancy of the historic Christian faith. We're delighted that each of you are with us on this cold and blustery evening, but I also want to recognize just a few special guests who are here tonight, including our chairman, Price Harding, who's joined us from Atlanta, Trustee Doug Wilson, Trustee Richard Miles and his wife Phoebe and daughter Elena, as well as Senator Ben Sass, who is out there somewhere with his 5-year-old son, Breck. Thank you all. We also know there were many people who wanted to be here tonight but could not make it, whether they were deterred by the cold, by other commitments or whatnot. So if you had friends who wanted to be here tonight but are not here, fear not. Video will be up on our website within 48 hours. There will also be pics and different video clips on our Facebook page, and photos from tonight will be posted as well, so you can tag your friends on Facebook. I know for many of you, this is your first Trinity Forum event. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Trinity Forum, we work to provide a space and resources for the discussion of life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do this by providing readings and publications which draw upon classic works of literature and letters in order to connect the timeless wisdom of the humanities with timely issues of the day, as well as sponsoring programs such as the one tonight to connect thinking leaders with leading thinkers and engaging those big questions of life, and ultimately in coming to better know the author of the answers. With each new evening conversation, we try to take on and wrestle with one of those big questions. And certainly, it's hard to imagine a bigger question than how we as Christians should think about not only the private practice of our faith, but also its implications for public engagement. And for decades, arguably the dominant mode of Christian public engagement was political, where various organizations organized values voters to fight culture wars by seeking to elect leaders who shared a similar worldview. But despite many electoral victories, there's a growing sense that an overtly political emphasis has failed or even backfired, leaving both widespread resentment of the strident tone and heavy-handed tactics employed by those who claim to speak for the faith, as well as new legal challenges to Orthodox Christian practice, and a sense of cultural ground lost. Our keynote speaker tonight takes this even further, arguing that there are not only the external threats to Christian practice much greater, but Christians themselves have largely accommodated themselves to a secular culture. He insists that what we need is a different strategy altogether, one that involves embracing a limited withdrawal from the world in order to more effectively show the love of God into it. In this view, he says, rather than wasting energy and resources fighting unwinnable political battles, we should instead work on building communities, institutions, networks, a resistance that can outwit, outlast, and eventually overcome the occupation, as well as give greater emphasis to discipleship, which, he argues, the collapse of Christian belief and practice in the United States is increasingly unlikely if we don't pay more attention to that. It is a thought-provoking, dramatic, even controversial argument, and it is hard to imagine a writer who can make it with more conviction, enthusiasm, boldness, or persistence than our speaker tonight. Rod Dreyer serves as the senior editor of the American Conservative, is a prolific writer and blogger of articles that have appeared in numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, National Review, First Things, Touchstone, the LA Times, and the Weekly Standard. He's also blogged at BeliefNet, as well as the American Conservative, and appears frequently on NPR and BBC. He is also the author of the colorfully, if not concisely titled, Crunchy Cons: How Birkenstocked Burkeans, Gun-Loving Organic Farmers, Organic Gardeners, Evangelical Free-Range Farmers, Hip Homeschooling Mamas, Right-Wing Nature Lovers, and their diverse tribe of countercultural conservatives plan to save America, or at least the Republican Party.
It didn't work.
As well as additional titles, The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming and How Dante Can Save Your Life. His latest work published yesterday entitled The Benedict Option, A Strategy for Christians in a Post-Christian World, which we've invited him today here to discuss, has prompted or provoked a remarkable number of reviews, reactions, dissents, and cheers, leading one respectful, if critical, reviewer to already call it already the most discussed and important religious book of the decade. Responding to Rod will be Kirsten Powers and Pete Weiner. Kirsten Powers is a political pundit, columnist, author, and analyst for CNN. She's worked as a columnist for USA Today, Newsweek, The Daily Beast, and The American Prospect, and her articles on politics have appeared widely, including in such publications as The Wall Street Journal, The New York Observer, and Salon. She previously served as an on-air contributor to Fox News and served in the Clinton administration as the Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Public Affairs, as well as being the author of The Silencing: How the Left is Killing Free Speech. In addition, we will hear in response to Rod, Pete Weiner. Pete is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, as well as a contributing writer and columnist for the New York Times. He writes widely on political, cultural, religious, and national security issues for many publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, also the Weekly Standard, National Affairs, and Time Magazine. He has served in the last 3 Republican administrations, including as the Deputy Director of Speechwriting, and later the Director of the Office of Strategic Initiatives, or Strategery, for President George W. Bush. He is also the co-author, along with Mike Gerson, of City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era, as well as Wealth and Justice, The Morality of Democratic Capitalism, which he co-authored with Arthur Brooks. Immediately after Rod's keynote address, Kirsten, Pete, and I will join him up front, and we'll hear responses from both Kirsten and Pete, followed by a short discussion, and then questions from the audience. Rod, welcome.
Thank you. You know, I'm so grateful to my friend David Brooks for his kind words about the Benedict Option being the most important religious book of the decade, but I think we all know the truth is the most important religious book aside from the Bible of this or any other decade is a confederacy of dunces. Proper theology and geometry is the ne plus ultra of our common life. And thank you for coming out on this very cold night. I write in the Benedict Option about the importance of asceticism, and I think you've really shown it tonight by coming out. And also, I love, as you can tell from the book, I love the medieval church, and so those of you who are Catholic who came out tonight can collect your indulgences on the way out. Well, anyway, if you've been following the whole Benedict Option discussion, you will have seen some criticism of me and my proposal for being alarmist. Well, those critics are right. I am alarmist about the state of our culture and of our civilization and the condition of the church within it. If you're a faithful Christian and you're not alarmed, I think you're failing to pay attention. You're failing to read the signs of the times. I do not claim that the world is coming to an end. This is not a late great planet Earth kind of speech. No man knows the day or the hour. What I am claiming, though, is that a world is coming to an end. And if believing Christians don't take radical action right now, the faith that made Western civilization will not survive for long into the Western civilization's post-Christian phase. A few years ago, a noted public intellectual said, quote, "It is obligatory to compare today's situation with the decline of the Roman Empire. In its final days, Rome still functioned as a great historical framework, but in practice, its vital energy had been depleted." This intellectual went on to lament the collapse of the spiritual forces that sustain our civilization. That public intellectual was Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. When the heir of a global throne that has been in existence continuously for nearly 2,000 years says that the West is facing its greatest spiritual crisis since the fall of the Roman Empire, attention must be paid. What are the signs of the times then? After all, the West is living through a time of unprecedented peace and prosperity, though I hardly need to point out that there's a mounting sense of political crisis throughout our civilization. But the signs also of our spiritual depletion are impossible to deny, and if we are spiritually depleted and morally exhausted, our peace and prosperity will not long last. I won't recite for you a litany of statistics tonight, but I do want to focus on a few that are of particular interest to Christians. The Christian faith is flat on its back in secular Europe. The United States has long been thought of as a counterexample to the secularization thesis, but that's no longer tenable. Writing last year in the American Journal of Sociology, scholars David Voas and Mark Chavez say that the data now show that the U.S. is on the same downward path to disbelief pioneered by our European cousins. According to data from the Pew Research Center, 1 in 3 18 to 29-year-olds have put religion aside if they ever picked it up in the first place. Those younger Americans who do remain affiliated in some capacity with the institutional churches have been formed by a pseudo-religion that resembles Christianity in name only. Notre Dame sociologist Christian Smith and his colleagues call this moralistic therapeutic deism. MTD uses the language and conceptual vocabulary of historical biblical Christianity, but in fact, it teaches a malleable, feel-good, Jesus-like philosophy perfectly suited to a consumerist, individualist, post-Christian society that worships the self. Christian Smith and his research colleagues found that MTD is the de facto religion of young Americans today. And I would say not just young Americans. I was raised in this too. This is American civic religion, but it's not the same thing as Christianity. In findings published in 2011, Christian Smith found that among 18 to 23-year-old Christians surveyed, only 40% said that their personal moral beliefs were grounded in the Bible or some other religious sensibility. An astonishing 61% of these so-called emerging adults said that they have no moral problem at all with materialism or consumerism, and added 30% expressed some qualms, but figured that it's really not worth worrying about because they can't do anything about it anyway. In this view, said Smith, quote, all that society is, apparently, is a collection of autonomous individuals out to enjoy life, unquote. America has lived a long time off its thin Christian veneer, partly necessitated by the Cold War, Smith told me in an interview. That is all finally being stripped away by the combination of mass consumer capitalism and liberal individualism, he said. The Marxist sociologist Zygmunt Bauman coined a phrase that perfectly captures the revolutionary spirit of our time and place: liquid modernity. Modernity, as we know, is characterized by a conscious break with the authority of the past and its institutions. For Zygmunt Bauman, solid modernity describes the first phase of modernity, in which the pace of change had quickened, but was still slow enough for most people to adjust. Things still seemed more or less solid. But now we have moved into liquid modernity, a time in which the pace of change is so rapid that nothing, no new institutions, no new habits, no new customs, has time to solidify. In liquid modernity, Bauman said, the most successful person is the one who has no allegiances beyond himself and his self-interest. He can change his loyalties and beliefs at will to suit his own preferences. There is no solid ground anymore. Now, from a Christian perspective, I liken liquid modernity to the great flood of the Bible. All the familiar landmarks of our faith are being submerged and swept away. The flood, in my view, this flood, cannot be turned back. The best we can do as believers today is to construct arcs within which we can ride out the storm, ride out the flood, and by God's grace, make it across the sea of time to a future in which we find dry land again and can start the rebuilding, the reseeding, and the renewal of the earth. So what is the Benedict option? What does it have to do with this very dire scenario I paint? The term comes from the famous final paragraph of Alistair MacIntyre's 1981 book, After Virtue. In that book, the philosopher explained how Enlightenment modernity overthrew the old traditional source of moral order, rooted in Christianity and classical philosophy. But it could not produce an authoritative, binding replacement for it. The West, on MacIntyre's view, has been unraveling for some time now, and is finally reaching a point of reckoning. Liberalism is not sufficient to do the work, the necessary work of binding society together and giving its members purpose. And by liberalism, I'm talking about liberal democracy and the way of thinking that characterizes modern times, whether you identify yourself as a Republican or a Democrat on the political right or left. We're all liberals in the broadest sense. In his book's conclusion, Alistair MacIntyre compared our present time to Rome's collapse, like Pope Benedict. Though MacIntyre indicated that our wealth obscures our eyes from this inner reality. In post-imperial Roman times, he said, some men and women of virtue quit trying to shore up the imperium, that is the existing social and political order, and instead focused on building new forms of community within which they could live out their moral traditions amid civilization's ruins. MacIntyre famously said that today we await, quote, a new and doubtless very different St. Benedict. Benedict of Norcia is known today as the founder of Western monasticism and one of the patron saints of Europe. He was born in the year 480, 4 years after the final Roman emperor abdicated. He was sent down, Benedict was, from his town of Norcia in the Italian mountains to the city of Rome as a pious young man to complete his education. What he saw there in the Rome of the barbarians revolted him. Benedict lit out for the forest to pray and to fast and to seek God's will for his life. Eventually, when he emerged, he had a reputation for sanctity, and he founded 12 monasteries governed by a kind of monastic constitution called the Rule of St. Benedict. The Rule is a plain, thin pamphlet that's all about running a monastery, rules for running a monastery, which Benedict called a school for the Lord's service. It is not a book of spiritual secrets. It is a book that simply sets out an order for living, for the sake of training monastics in the spiritual life. You would never guess from reading it, and you can read it in one sitting, that this little book played a key role in saving Western civilization. After St. Benedict died, monasticism exploded. Monks moved all over barbarian-ruled Europe. They brought the faith to unchurched people. They taught them how to pray, but they also taught the peasants how to make things, how to build things, how to grow things, skills that had been lost in Rome's collapse. And in their rituals and in their libraries, the monks kept alive the cultural memory of Christian Rome. Because these monks took a vow of stability, that is, a sacred promise to remain in the monastery where they first took their vows until the end of their lives, peasants gathered around the monasteries as citadels of light and order in a very dark and chaotic and dangerous time. In this way, the Benedictine monasteries of the first years of St. Benedict and his followers were arks carrying the faith across the troubled waters that had obliterated Roman civilization. It all happened not because St. Benedict of Norcia had set out to make Rome great again, but because he sought to figure out how to best serve the Lord in community during a terrible civilizational crisis. Everything else followed from that. So in my book, The Benedict Option, I write about my visits to the Benedictine monastery today in the town of Norcia, which is the modern Italian name for Norcia, the saint's birthplace. I interviewed the monks there about how their core values and practices can be applied to everyday Christian life for people outside the monastery. Prayer, work, hospitality, asceticism, stability, community. In Benedictine daily life, all these things work together in balance to lead the monks toward a sense of life-giving order, suffused by a sense of the sacredness of life. In other words, they are being led by this order, by their way of life to unity with Christ. Father Cassian Folsom, who was at the time the prior or the leader of the Norcia Monastery, told me that the monastery and its life of Christ-focused prayer is a sign of contradiction to the modern world. The guardrails have disappeared and the world risks careering off a cliff, Father Cassian told me. But we, meaning we in the world, are so captured by the lights and the motions of modern life that we don't recognize the danger. The forces of dissolution from popular culture are too great for individuals or families to resist on their own. We need to embed ourselves in stable communities of faith, close quote. Well, what does this look like for ordinary Christians? We know what it looks like for monks and for nuns, but for ordinary Christians who may not even be Catholic, what does this look like for we who are called to live in the world? Does the Benedict Option call for all Christians to head for the hills and build high walls to keep the impurity of the world far away? Not at all. Let me underscore this, not at all. We have to evangelize. We have to serve the world, or we are failing the Great Commission. We have to serve our neighbors, or we fail to serve our Lord. Put all thoughts of total withdrawal out of your mind. That is not what the Benedict Option calls for. But it does call for a strategic separation from the everyday world. Well, what do I mean by that? I mean that we have to erect some walls, so to speak, between ourselves and our communities and the world for the sake of our own spiritual formation in discipleship. In this hedonistic, individualistic, post-Christian society, the dissipating force of the outside culture is overwhelming. We really cannot expect to go out into it unguarded and to keep our candle lit any more than we could leave a church with a candle in a gale force wind and expect it to stay lit. Here's the paradox of the Benedict Option. If the church is going to be the blessing for the world that God means for it to be, then the church is going to have to spend more time away from the world, deepening our commitment to God, deepening our knowledge of Scripture, deepening our relationship to the tradition and our knowledge of the historic Christian church, and thickening our relationship to each other. We Christians cannot give the world what we do not have. We should engage with the world, but not at the expense of our fidelity and our sense of ourselves as a people set apart. Let me use a couple of examples from the Hebrew Bible to illustrate what I mean. In Jeremiah chapter 29, the Lord, speaking through a letter from the prophet Jeremiah, tells his people in their Babylonian exile to settle in the city and to integrate into the city's life. But the Lord also warns, do not let the prophets and dividers among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. Well, what is that about? In the exile community, there were would-be prophets who told the Jewish people exactly what they wanted to hear. But it was a comforting lie. Jeremiah, though, he was a true prophet. We might say that because Jeremiah lived outside of the exile community, he could hear the Lord's voice more clearly. Somehow, though, the Jews in exile in Babylon had to figure out how to obey God's command to integrate into Babylonian society while at the same time not being assimilated. In the book of Daniel, we read the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 3 Jews who were state officials under King Nebuchadnezzar. When the king ordered all his officials to bow down before a false idol, those 3 men refused, even on pain of death. As we all know from the story, the king threw them into the firing furnace, but the fire in the furnace did not consume them. Nebuchadnezzar then repented and restored Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to their position. I think we have to ask ourselves, how did they do it? How did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego live lives that were integrated into the establishment of Babylon? But how did they also develop such a strong faith that they were willing to lose everything, even their lives, before bowing down to an idol? That is the question facing Christians today in our own Babylonian exile here in post-Christian America. We must somehow walk a path between the Christian fundamentalists who reject everything about the world and the accommodationist who love the world so much that they can rationalize idol worship for the sake of preserving their peaceful lives and even their privileges. Engaging the culture must never become an excuse to burn a pinch of incense to Caesar. Winsomeness must never be a veil concealing our cowardice from ourselves. There must have been something about the daily lives of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Babylon that trained them and formed them spiritually, so that when they were put to the ultimate test, they passed. It has to be that way with us too. We are failing. We in the church are failing at this today and failing badly. The numbers, the statistics I cited earlier in this talk tell a tale of Christian infidelity. The world is not doing this to us. We're doing it to ourselves. If we don't change the way we're living, we're not going to survive as the church. The handwriting is on the wall. We will be assimilated. There is no middle way. In the Benedict Option, I talk about various ways that we can and should do this. I write about education, work, prayer, and worship, family and community, the way we use technology, and the way we approach sex and sexuality. There is no time tonight to go into all of those, but I do want to say a few words about one area that is on everybody's mind tonight in Washington, D.C., and that's politics. As I was writing in this book, like I bet almost everybody in this room, I expected Hillary Clinton to win the presidency. Had that happened, I believe the future of religious liberty would have been very bleak. It did not happen, though. Today, I hear some conservative Christians breathing a sigh of relief, as if Donald Trump's victory signaled an all clear. Do not believe that, not even for 1 second. I'm as pleased by the Neil Gorsuch nomination as any conservative, but note well that we have not seen a religious liberty executive order from this president, nor do we see much enthusiasm in the Republican-led Congress to pass religious liberty legislation. I fear that conservative Christians may ultimately end up having been played for fools by this administration. I hope I'm wrong. I genuinely do. But let's get serious. Even if Donald Trump were a saint, even if, he could not turn back the cultural tsunami of liquid modernity. This is far beyond the power of politics alone. If America had elected a cross between Pericles and Billy Graham, we would still need the Benedict Option. And I should point out, I was writing about the Benedict Option a decade before the Indiana RFRA debacle and the Obergefell decision. If same-sex marriage did not exist, and many Christians see that rightly as a big challenge to us, if same-sex marriage did not exist, we would still need the Benedict Option. The core problem is not gay people, or liberal Democrats, or Muslim immigrants, or anybody else. The core problem is a culture and a civilization that has abandoned Christian orthodoxy. The problem, my Christian friends, is us. Recovery and rebuilding the world we have lost is going to take the work of centuries. I really believe that. I believe that we have to stay active in conventional politics, working as we are able to for the common good, and especially fighting to protect religious liberty, upon which so much depends. But we cannot afford to make the same mistake as a prior generation of religious conservatives. The religious right of old thought that the problem was that American culture was fundamentally moral, and that if our side could capture political offices and capture the judiciary, then we could restore the republic to its rightful moral footing. The problem was the liberal secular elites who ruled us. They were wrong about that. Republicans kept winning, a fact that obscured in the eyes of so many of us conservative Christians the steady loss of the culture. I believe that politics in the Benedict Option should be primarily localist and small c Catholic in its scope. It is more important for us to strengthen churches, to start schools, to build up local community than it is to shore up the imperium, to make the empire great again. I want America to prosper. I love this country. This country is my home. I have nowhere else to go. But it is far more important to me to be a faithful Christian than it is to be a good American. These two should not be in conflict, but if and when they do become in conflict, I want to be counted as a servant of the Lord, not the king. Do I worry about persecution in the rest of my lifetime? To an extent, I do. You really can't talk to law professors, doctors, educators, and others who follow the religious liberty debate and are living it out in their daily lives and remain sanguine about the future. Pastors and parents and educators, Christian educators, who do not prepare those under their authority for that kind of future are failing in their duty. But as I see it again, the greater problem right now is the steady erosion of authentic Christianity by the relentlessness of individualism, hedonism, and consumerism. And we also have to face the fact that in some quarters on the right, even among conservative Christians, we are seeing the rise of an ungodly racism that we have to rebuke and not allow into our lives or our churches. If we're going to stay true to our faith, we're going to have to listen to voices from outside the right here and right now, authoritative voices from the Christian past, especially the pre-modern era, including most of all the early church. How else are we going to be able to tell the difference between those who are speaking comforting lies that we very comfortable middle-class American Christians want to hear, and those who, like Jeremiah, preach the prophetic word of God? How will we tell the difference? We must beware of religious leaders who are content simply to be chaplains to the contemporary cultural order. That way is what Pope John Paul II called the culture of death. Marco Sermarini is an Italian Catholic layman and a community leader who is one of these new and very different St. Benedicts of our time. When I visited his thriving, joyfully Orthodox Catholic community in Italy, I asked Marco, "How did you guys do it?" He said to me, "We invented nothing. We discovered nothing. We are only rediscovering a tradition that was locked away inside an old box. We had forgotten. Today they remember, and they're building their lives around those memories and making those memories live again." Modernity is a time of forced forgetting. The Benedict Option is, in a sense, a project of preserving the memory of what it is to be Christian by preserving the memory of what it has meant in the past. Hope is memory plus desire. If we remember as Christians who we are and desire to bring those memories to life again, we have every reason to hope. We may not have reason to be optimistic, but we have every reason to hope. But we cannot ignore the warning that Father Cassian Folsom of Norcia gave me when I visited there the first time. The old monk told me that if Christian families, churches, and communities in the West do not do some form of the Benedict Option, then, quote, they are not going to make it. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Rod. That's a lot to chew on and a lot to respond to. And turning to respondents, we'll hear first from Kirsten and then from Pete.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? So first of all, I just want to thank Rod for that. And I've been a big fan of his writing for a long time. His last two books were really, had a major impact on me, especially the Dante book. I can in some ways say how Rod Dreher's Dante's book saved my life, because I really love his heart and his dedication to his faith and how he really wrestles through all these issues that I think a lot of us are wrestling through. And in this book, look at all these people in this room, I think he's obviously speaking to something that a lot of people are wrestling with. And I think, asking questions about how to be a Christian in a culture that feels sometimes like it can be very hostile. So I think it started a really good conversation. And I'll just start with the parts of the book that I think resonated with me, that I agreed with, which I think really identifying the individualism and consumerism. And I should also say, you should give me like a warning when I'm getting close. The individualism and consumerism, which is so toxic to our culture and obviously to Christianity. And I think he spends a lot of time on that, and that's really important and something that we all need to think about. And I think he also speaks to the desire of parents who want to have a culture where they feel that their children still have some innocence and discovery on a sort of reasonable timeline, where they don't feel that that's completely out of their control. And I think that that's an important thing. And that, there is a real lack of discipleship, and that he spends a lot of time talking about what is wrong in the church, and that what Christians are doing wrong, that it's not just secular culture that's the problem, that there are a lot of problems within the church. And these are actually going to be more questions for you to address, because I think we're sort of working this through, but some of the things that struck me where I felt a little disconnect with what you were arguing was, talking about sort of looking at our culture, and that now is kind of the breaking point, now that we're in a so-called sort of dark ages, and that somehow in the past we had a culture that was, a pretty great culture and that wasn't problematic for Christians. And when I think about that, I think obviously of slavery and segregation. Those are things that are, a little far removed from where we are today, but nonetheless, Christianity thrived and survived and unfortunately enabled that in a lot of ways. But even since then, we've had Christianity, Christians didn't feel like they needed to leave the culture, despite a lot of racism and misogyny and mass incarceration and wars that I don't think we needed to have, that killed a lot of innocent people, a lack of health care for people, and indifference to the poor. There are a lot of things, the way we treat undocumented immigrants, that I think, a question that I would love to have addressed is like, why is this the breaking point? Why were the other things not the breaking point? As a woman, frankly, I thank God every day that I was born when I was born, and I wasn't born 1 minute earlier, because I look back even at my mother's life as a professional woman, and the things that, that she went through, the fact that sexual harassment actually wasn't even a term, the fact that women, when they were raped, were treated as villains in their own rapes. I mean, there are a lot of things that were really wrong with our society, and not that long ago. And then in a lot of ways, when I think of it, when I think of how gay people were treated, I think, actually we've gotten a lot better in a lot of ways. We actually are a more humane, more tolerant society in a lot of ways. And so, trying to understand why you see things as darkly as you do. I do totally accept your premise about how Christians are being marginalized in this culture. I wrote an entire book, frankly, about called The Silencing, about how people were being silenced. It's important to remember it's not just Christians, though. There are a lot of people who are very secular, left people, who are feminists, who are atheists, who are also persecuted for saying things that don't hew to the sort of left-wing dogma, whether it's Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's a, atheist, pro-choice feminist, or Charles Murray more recently was, harassed. So I think it's something that's a bigger problem in the culture. And one of the things that I was thinking about is what has changed, and what has changed is that white Christians are no longer in charge of the culture. And so it strikes me a little bit that that's the breaking point, that the breaking point is that, now that it's gotten to the point that we're not in control anymore, let's just pick up the marbles and go home, because we wanted to be in charge of culture, and we don't like the fact that we're not anymore. And Robert Jones at PRRI had actually did a survey of Trump voters, evangelicals, looking at why they were voting for Donald Trump, despite the fact that he offended so many things that would normally offend evangelicals. And what he found was that they were what he called nostalgia voters. They wanted Donald Trump to take them back to when they were in charge of the culture. And so from my personal perspective, I became a believer later in life. I grew up in a very secular, my parents were professors. I then went into democratic politics. I was in a very secular world. By the time I became a Christian, unlike most of my Christian friends who grew up Christian, where it actually was a benefit to be a Christian, there was very little price to pay for it. It was a good thing. They lived in a place where everybody was a Christian. I actually was the opposite. It was the opposite of privilege. It was weird. It was, considered not intellectual. It was looked down on. It had a cost, right? So I never existed in this paradigm where I was a privileged Christian. So I don't really understand that, because I sort of, when I think of how we're supposed to interact with society, for me it's always kind of come with a cost. It's always come with a price. It's always come with kind of being a little bit marginalized. And I have never really had that much of a problem with that. And I think, when you look at the Bible, we're supposed to be aliens and strangers in our culture. We're not, you're talking about Jeremiah. I mean, Jeremiah was a prophet, and I think a prophet will often have to remove themselves in a way that maybe other people won't. But the people he was speaking to, he was saying, build your houses, next to their houses, raise your children with their children, pray for them to prosper. As they prosper, you will prosper. So the role of the Christian is really to help society prosper, and it's to live among them. And you'll notice that they never asked the society around them to adopt their views or to live their view, for the culture to somehow reflect what they believed. They were just told to just live your lives and be godly and be good people and serve. And I think that, to me, that's sort of what I feel we're called to do. If you look at the New Testament, obviously, Paul was not telling everybody, go try to get the religious freedom laws passed and, change public policy. They were serving people. They were being persecuted. And I think that, it's very much of a, again, we're supposed to be ambassadors for Christ, which means, you need to be in it. You need to be there with people. We're supposed to be salt and light. I mean, when I start looking through all the different things, one of the, 2 great commandments, to love your neighbors. To me, that also would suggest that you need to really be living with other people. And so when I look through all those things, and I feel like even this, I guess you're saying it's not a total withdrawal, but that it is some sort of separation that I think could be good for some people. There definitely are some people who need to do that, but I think for most Christians, probably we're supposed to stay in the culture and be more in the thick of it. And Pope Francis, in The Joy of the Gospel, he writes, I dream of a missionary option that is a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything, so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world rather than for her self-preservation. So I think we need to be careful about being too focused on what's happening to Christians, too self-focused, right? Even if, and I think, and then expecting it to be easy and expecting the culture to embrace us and expecting the culture to reflect what our values are. And I think that one of the big issues in our society right now is the fact that people feel so isolated and so disconnected. And Christians are in a really unique position, I think, to serve society on that front. And I think that it's one of the only places that I really see people wrestling through these issues are faith communities, really talking about how can we have a life of meaning, how can we be more connected, be more loving, serving other people. And I think for us to withdraw in any way would be, in a way, selfish. That I think that right now, when you look at what is wrong with society, it is that. And I think that we have a really unique opportunity to serve people. Another area that I would love for you to address, Rod, is sort of the role. I mean, you talk about sort of withdrawing from politics to a certain extent, except maybe with religious freedom. And but I think one of the things that I would be interested in your thoughts on is how much does the sort of free market ideology cause a lot of this sort of consumerism and individualism, right? And that's not a partisan thing. Democrats and Republicans, I think it's just sort of, it's accepted in this country that, the free market rules and we'll let the free market handle things, and we're all kind of arguing around the edges. But
I've got a book for you to read.
Yeah.
Punching cards.
Yeah, and that, you talk in the book, you actually bring up I think it's a friend's father who's German, and how he was only able to really be present in his family life and really have a more contemplative life because of the labor laws in Germany, and because they basically said you can't be open on the weekends. And so, that's the kind of thing, sort of public policy things that I feel, need to be discussed, and that, again, withdrawing from that, I feel could be harmful to society, that we actually should be arguing for creating a culture that provides more support for people so that they actually do have the freedom to not feel like they have to work 2 jobs or all the time because they don't have health insurance and they don't have a pension and they don't have, all of these things. How am I doing on time?
Right there.
Yeah, and done. You want me to wrap up?
Whenever you're ready.
Yeah. So, okay. I mean, I could go on and on. There were so many things.
I'm not going to remember everything you said. I'm like, I should have brought a notebook.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, we can let Pete start. Go now then.
Okay, I'll take part 2.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ree and Rod and Kirsten and everyone for being here. It was interesting in your remarks, Rod, that you said that the Benedict option, some people heard it as a call to head for the hills, and it's not that at all. And I thought during the 2016 presidential election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, I thought, where the heck are the hills that I can head to? I was all for total withdrawal, full retreat, and complete separation. So I'm still looking for those hills. There's actually a lovely verse in the Psalms. I'll lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. And after the election, I decided that the Lord made heaven. The Benedict option, you should buy it, you should read it. You should read it especially if you disagree with it. And the reason is that Rod is a very articulate exponent for his point of view, and we actually don't get that enough in our time. So it's a book that I read with great interest, and he's a lovely writer, and he's a man actually with a good spirit and a good heart, and that comes through too. Let me begin. I'll use the same framework that Kirsten did, which is what I appreciated about the book, some differences that I had, and then we can go into the Q&A. In terms of what I liked about it, it's that in this increasingly complacent time, Rod is a true believer. And I mean that in the best way possible. He takes his Christian faith very seriously, and he wants others to share his faith and to take it seriously too. And it's a challenging book for those like me whose hearts, frankly, have not been transformed and consecrated in the ways that I wish that it had over the course of my Christian life. And Rod believes that he sees things that the rest of us don't. He senses dangers that he thinks the rest of us ignore, and he's trying to shake us from what he believes to be our complacency. There's a lovely line in the prelude. Yes, it's a poem from Wordsworth where he says, "What we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how." And Rod, I think, views this book as an effort to translate what he loves and what he wants to teach to others. And I say that even though, as you'll see, I have disagreements with it. And second is that the book introduces us to this remarkable community, the Monks of Norcia, and he shares their lives with us, and I thought that was a real gift. These are people who open their hearts and monastery to him, and I sensed it was a life-altering experience for you, and that you were different, and I think you would probably say a better man for having been in the company of these people. And while we can't be in their company, it is a bit of osmosis that you learn about them. Third, I appreciated what he has to say about the whole notion of separation and setting apart and being pilgrims and sojourners in this world. I think that I felt that over really most of my adult life, Christians, certainly in politics, have probably integrated too much and not been enough separation. But I don't think of the separation in a physical way or a geographic way or a cultural cul-de-sac. I really think of it more as the orientation of the heart and the belief that people of the Christian faith have. And I've seen this in the Christians that I've most respected in my life. They have a deep sense that they're citizens of another city, that people didn't build and cannot destroy, and which is everlasting. And the irony, or at least I think for some people it's a surface irony, is the people who see that the best are the ones who are most engaged in this world, in the good works of the world, in the works that will last. So I think that there's been too much sloppy, I guess, accommodation of Christians in the world, and I think Rod takes that on. I also thought his chapter on politics was intelligent and careful and an important corrective, especially given the damage done to the Christian witness by prominent evangelicals who not only supported Donald Trump for president, but rhapsodized about him. Cherie said that I'd worked in the last 3 Republican administrations. I can promise you I will not work in the 4th Republican administration. He recommends that Christians embrace localism without giving up important national battles, like the one on preserving religious liberty, which is the sine qua non of when it comes to building thriving Christian subcultures. And he wants Christians to engage practically and effectively in public life without losing their integrity, which turns out to be a rather difficult task. I have never been a person in my entire Christian life, and I came to faith. I didn't grow up as a Christian, so a little bit later. But I was never one who felt like Christians should separate from politics, because I believe that politics in the end, in its best sense, in its deepest sense really, is about the human condition. And there's a huge human cost to getting politics wrong. But I must say that the way that I think that Christians have engaged in politics really over the last 35 years has done tremendous damage to the Christian witness. And I'm happy to go into details if people want during the Q&A. But I think that is an important thing to keep in mind, and that balance wheel of how to stay engaged in a way that preserves integrity is not easy. The Benedict Option also shows a certain fearlessness. He defends Orthodox Christian views on sexuality when such views are not particularly popular, shall we say, and are increasingly considered benighted. For example, he makes a persuasive case about the moral and spiritual damage caused by pornography, including the ways that it rewires the brain. It's not fashionable to take a stand like that, but Rod is right to mention it, and he seems indifferent to the criticisms that might come his way. If you're a parent trying to raise children today, and you're not facing the problem of pornography, then I suspect you're not engaged, or you're living on a planet different than Earth. It's hard, and it's not just children either. And the number of devoted Christian men, in particular, who deal with this is real, and we can pretend it doesn't exist, and we can laugh at people who bring it up, but it's a real issue, and Rod is willing to take it on. And he argues for Christian anthropology and what he refers to as the rightly ordered use of the gift of sexuality, pointing out that this was among the great distinctives setting apart the early church from the pagan world. And whether you agree with him on the particulars or not, he presents his case in a very good way. As far as the differences, I feel like he paints with too broad a brush. At points, the book had an element of a polemic to me, a kind of a lawyer's brief. And sometimes the picture that's presented, while hardly false, I think is hardly balanced. A couple of examples, the Enlightenment in his chapter on the roots of the crisis, which is worth reading. He identifies one of those roots as the Enlightenment, about which I think he has nothing good to say. He describes it as having, quote, displaced the Christian religion with the cult of reason, privatized religious life, and inaugurated the age of democracy. I think there are worse indictments of a movement than it inaugurated the age of democracy. And elsewhere he says enlightened liberalism contained the seeds of Christianity's undoing. I want to do justice, you'd have to read his book to do justice to what he says, but I don't believe that, and I think that the human heart is the great danger here. Solzhenitsyn, I think it was in the Gulag Archipelago, talked about how that it's the line of good and evil goes down at every human heart. And in any event, enlightened liberalism has allowed for Christianity to coexist with freedom and democracy, and that's no small thing. And it gave us extraordinary advances in science and capitalism and freedom. It lifted the human condition immeasurably. It allowed people to live older lives. It allowed their children to live longer. And it's made possible for us to live in a free society. couple of other things, and I'll conclude on the Dark Ages. That's a term that Rod refers to. He talked about it in his remarks here, and it appears throughout the book. I think that portrayal of a modern American society is much too bleak. For all the cultural problems and moral decay we have experienced, several key indicators, rates of abortion, crime, divorce, teen pregnancy, teen sexual activity, have shown considerable progress in recent years. Life in America is like life in America has always been, which is a mixed bag. Some things are getting better, some things are getting worse, some things are staying the same. And I felt like there was a lack of nuance there. Kristen talked about the Dark Ages. I think if you were maybe a white male Orthodox Christian in your mid-50s, you may begin to think that's a dark age. I don't think so. If you're a black African in Birmingham in 57, or a 13-year-old gay kid from a fundamentalist church in Phoenix in 1973, or a woman in the workforce and subject to sexual harassment in 1967, or a child working in a dangerous factory during the Industrial Revolution, or a slave in 1857 who was on the receiving end of branding and shootings and floggings, you wouldn't view today as the new dark age. Finally, I found myself feeling the book was disproportionately focused on sexuality in a way that Jesus, as one example, was not. And I'll grant Rod that our time is different from that of Jesus, but they're not that much different. Greco-Roman culture wouldn't have been shocked by much that emerged from the sexual revolution, and yet Jesus focused the bulk of his warnings on legalism, on self-righteousness, and on pride. The main concern of Jesus was not sexual immorality. It existed, but that was not the main source of his concern. It was ecclesiastical moralism. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity makes this distinction between what he calls the animal and the diabolical self. And he says, the sins of the flesh are bad, but they're the least bad of all sins. All the worst pleasures are purely spiritual, the pleasures of putting other people in a wrong, of bossing and patronizing and spoiling sport and backbiting, the pleasure of power and of hatred. And I felt like I wish Rod had spent more time on the diabolical self and less on the animal self. In conclusion, whatever differences in emphasis and tone I might have with Rod, I do think they're minor compared with what I believe are the book's virtues. Even his Lamentations are leavened by hopefulness, his concerns rooted in a desire for people to live lives of purpose and of meaning. In an increasingly faithless and complacent time, Rod is asking us to reflect in an intentional way on what true faithfulness means, what it might look like, and the joy that can emerge from it. The Benedict Option, in my mind, is the product of a man whose deepest longing is to serve the Lord he loves, and I think he does that very well.
Great, thank you. So this question is primarily for you, Rod, but I'd love to have both Kirsten and Pete, you both comment. In the reading your book, there may be readers who feel like you have a defensive stance in that somehow Christians are much more likely to be assimilated by our culture than to be agents of grace and transformation, even though we're called to be salt and light. Light, of course, pierces the darkness. Salt disinfects and purifies what's around it. And Jesus himself called us not only to holiness, but to love others, and reserved his worst criticism for the Pharisees who kept themselves distinct from Rome's secular culture. So how do we balance those two imperatives, both to be holy and to thicken the bonds between us, but also to love our neighbor, to be salt and light?
Well, I'll give you the answer that the monks in Norcia gave to me about why they are behind monastery walls. I mean, monks are called to be cloistered, Benedictine monks are, and we're not called to live behind cloister walls. But they said that when pilgrims come to Norcia to pray with the monks, to seek spiritual counsel, the monks say, we could not be for these pilgrims who Christ asked us to be if we didn't have all this time behind the wall in intense prayer, in fasting, in scripture study, and so on. All of that formation that they do behind the monastery walls is so they can present the face of Christ to the world that comes there, that comes to them, and that they have to welcome with hospitality. St. Benedict orders his monks to receive the stranger as if the stranger was Christ himself. For us, we are out in the world more, but if we are going to be the face of Christ for the world, I strongly believe that we have to spend a lot more time in engaging in spiritual disciplines, in reading the Bible, in fasting and asceticism, in prayer, and in doing the sort of things that form our hearts in ways that allow us to go into the marketplace and be who we're supposed to be, and not be pushed around by the winds of culture because we're not sure who we are. And I don't want us to be uncertain trumpets. And I think we have to be willing to sacrifice, even to suffer for the sake of our beliefs. I mean, Bonhoeffer, if he had not had all those years of prayer and spiritual training, he would not have had the courage that he did. Dr. King wouldn't have, and on and on and on. So we need to have that time out away from the world in the same way our Lord did when he went to the desert to pray and prepare for fast for 40 days before he started his public ministry. That need does not leave us as human beings. So if we're going to stay on the right path and be able to know when we've diverged from it, we have got to know our Bible better, we've got to know our heritage better, and we've got to be more thickly and more embedded within a community of accountability.
Any additional
Well,
comments?
it's interesting because when I was reading the book, and I have this scribbled throughout the book, is I felt like what you just said, and when you write the book, is I just sort of like, right, I mean, this is what being a Christian is, right? I don't feel like that's actually a Benedict option or any, it just, to me, that's just what I've always been told, whether it's when I went to Tim Keller's church in New York City or whether it's now in the Catholic Church, that all the things you just said are all always, it's called being a Christian. Like, that's really what you're supposed to be doing. And God is supposed to be the center of everything that we're doing, and we're supposed to be, fasting and praying and in community and all these other things. And so the part for me that I was trying to understand, like, why would now, because we don't like where culture is, now suddenly we have to be Christians, right? I mean, it was sort of confusing to me because I just felt like this is what we've always are supposed to be doing, and we all fall short of it, of course. But it is something that I think is at least a goal in my life, and I'm sure in yours. And so how is this different from that?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. You're right. All the Benedict option is a call for the church to be the church, to stop being absorbed in the world we're in today and picking and choosing what we want to believe because it's safe and comfortable and maintains our privilege, but to be the church. And I think, I live today. I don't live 100 years ago. I live today, and I see, when I go around to talk at Christian colleges and universities, I talk to professors there, whether they're Catholic colleges or evangelical colleges, and the professors all say the same thing. Young people come to them today completely unformed, not knowing much about doctrine or church history, and not having any practices. It's all about emotion. And I really get afraid of how defenseless that will leave us when we're put to the test. You got to remember, I grew up in the Deep South, and I was born 3 years after the Civil Rights Act. And well within living memory, the white church absolutely failed because we were so cultural in our Christianity. We failed. And we sat there and watched abuse and murder take place of our black brothers and sisters who are also Christians. That is the sort of thing that could happen to us today. But the people back then didn't see it. My ancestors didn't see what they were doing. Well, I feel that if they had been more deeply embedded in a countercultural Christianity, they might have seen it. Mm-hmm. That's the thing that worries me.
Yeah, on your question, Sharia, it's a good one. I think probably everybody in the room has just struggled with it to one degree or another. I guess my answer is, how do you maintain this balance wheel? I'll just speak here as a person of the Christian faith. It's to have your affections won over by Jesus, and that's easy to say and harder to do. But in my experience, that really is what's important. There has to be something that pulls your heart and your affections beyond the things of this world. And the world has a lot of pull. And there has to be a greater one, and your heart has to be, captured by grace. And the people that I've witnessed in my life who do it best aren't participating so much in cultural engagement as in personal engagement. That is, they're just involved in people's lives. They are very attuned to what people are going through. And I will just say, you know, as you kind of get in your middle years, you just find out that every life has a story. And a lot of those stories are stories, you know, of hardship and pain that isn't defining to people. Most people, you know, have lives of relative happiness. But there's a lot going on in the shadows of people's lives. And that is really what it means. And as a person of the Christian faith, I think that's the power, struck me very early in my Christian pilgrimage. It's the power of the cross. It's the notion of compassion, suffering with. It's the only major faith in which it's based on this idea of suffering as a way to compassion, as a way toward redemption and repair in people's lives. One other thing that I want to say, and this is important because when we talk about history of Christian persecution, first I just think that if you look at the history of persecution, what we're going through doesn't qualify as persecution. I mean, I get the gay guy, the baker that doesn't want to go to the gay wedding, and I know there are issues at Gordon College. Those are real. I just think in the history of Christianity, those don't qualify. America has been really an anomalous period. And the other thing I'd say is in the period of greatest vulnerability and political weakness for Christianity, it was the time of Christianity's most explosive growth. It kind of became a magnet to others as models of compassion. And Rodney Stark has written about this, and others have. And I think that's still probably, in the end, the way it goes. And Rod recognizes that. I think that's part of the power, and indeed what you yourself experienced, which is you were able to see models of people whose lives embodied what you thought was right, and you were pulled, you know, in that direction.
We definitely want to get in audience questions before the evening ends. Those of you who have been to Trinity Forum events before know that we have only 3 rules for questions. All questions should be brief. That is especially true tonight. We'll try to have a bunch of very brief questions, but also ask for concise answers. Secondly, all questions should be civil, goes without saying. And third, all questions should be in the form of a question. So with that, we have John and Ryan with microphones. Please wait for you to be called on. Wait for the microphone. Michelle right there. Ryan, halfway through, up.
Thank you. Thank you, Shuri, for convening this. I am so grateful to be here. I'd like to ask the author, how do you articulate your premise in a language of dissent? If you look at Václav Havel and The Power of the Powerless, he talks about creating a parallel culture, biding time until the moment to bring about change. To me, that makes sense because you're nurturing belief, waiting for something to happen. Is this perhaps what you're thinking about in the Benedict Option?
I'm so glad you brought up Václav Havel and the Czech dissidents. In my chapter on politics in the Benedict Option, I talked about how Havel and the Czech dissidents are models for us today as Christians in this culture steadily lose political power and cultural influence, as I think will happen over the rest of my life. The Czechs didn't sit around throwing their hands up in the air and say, we can't do anything, we're ruled by the communists. They set out, as you said, to build a parallel polis, what Václav Benda, a Catholic who was part of Havel's circle, called a parallel polis. He said, if you can't participate in public life in this country because you're not a Marxist, well, don't sit around and simply complain or privatize your faith. Get out in public, start a class. If you want your kids to be taught real humanities, real education instead of Marxist claptrap, then have a class. You know, teach them things, do something different, do something active that brings people together. There's no need to feel disempowered. If we just get together and do things on our own, we will feel a greater sense of power, even if we do not have formal power in the state. Certainly, we are very far from anything like what the Czechs suffered. And I don't want to say that I don't want anybody to go away from here saying, we're just like under communism. I don't believe that at all. Pete's right. You know, this is not persecution yet. But I think it could come. And if you talk to religious liberty lawyers, they are active in this, and law professors, they'll tell you that we're a lot closer than most people think. That said, what I'm going to do in the Benedict option is encourage Christians, if they do feel disempowered from ordinary politics, don't give up. Get involved in your local community. Start a classical Christian school. Get involved in your church, building your church up. Serve your neighbors. That's politics too. It's it's called, Pavel called it anti-political politics, because it was a politics of living in truth. And I think that's something that we as Christians in America have to acquaint ourselves with.
Right up here in the front row.
Since you mentioned Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
I come from Eastern Europe, so I resonated with just what you've said, because I grew up into the Christian faith by being trained by monks who were reading books which were forbidden, and the Philokalia, for instance, and they've created this counterculture, which was, of course, an opposition to the Marxist dogma. Thank you. I want to also say something that perhaps you've ignored in the recent decades, namely that America has liberated us, right? In Poland and Romania, we had a religious revival, Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, because Ronald Reagan and others have contributed to the demolition of the Berlin Wall. So thank you for that. Finally, Benedict was a monk, but also father. And the gift of fatherhood, it seems to me, a very important element into the Christian faith. Before Benedict, there was Augustine of Hippo, and before Augustine, there was Saint Anthony. And the writings of Anthony made Augustine become a Christian. When Anthony was in the desert as a monk and as a father, he got a letter, not from Donald Trump, but from the Emperor Constantine. And the emperor said to him, "Would you like to be my court theologian?" Imagine that, in Constantinople, 335. And he was puzzled because he was the leader of the monastic movement in Egypt. So he turned to his disciple called Paul. So the father turns to the son and says, "What should I do?" To which the son says, "Well, if you go to Constantinople, that is to the White House, you will be called Anthony. If you stay here in the desert, you will be called Father Anthony." So what do we lose and what do we gain when we engage politicians?
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for that. I believe that, and I wrote a book along these lines called The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming, about my late sister who, while her brother went off to Washington to be a journalist, in New York to be a journalist, she stayed behind in our small southern town of 1700 and taught in the public schools, and was a good neighbor and a mom. And when she died of cancer, she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at age 40 and lasted for 19 months. I didn't realize until I got back home to her funeral and just watching her, the courage with which she faced her death, the power of a small life well lived. You know, I call the book The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming in conscious reference to Saint Therese of Lisieux, who just led a very ordinary life, died at the age of 24, but after her writings were found, they were published all around the world, and she's one of the great doctors of the Catholic Church now. In a similar way, watching my sister's life and hearing at her funeral students that she had taught in our town, where there are a lot of poor kids who come from really broken families, they would come to me and say, "Sir, you have no idea what she did for me." It really showed me the power of somebody who lives in love in a small place to do good. So what I would say is it's very easy in a place like New York or Washington, places I both lived in and loved, to think that we're not really fighting for the kingdom unless we're embedded in institutions or have a big megaphone, which I've been privileged to have myself. But God sees things differently, and maybe the best thing we can do for the kingdom of God is to stay in a little town and serve the poor and the people God gives us to love and serve. And I think that we have to try to reconsider what our mission to the world is in light of how God sees things, not just how the world sees things. We may lose power, we may lose privilege, but we may also gain from that an opportunity for witness. Today, in today's world, people don't want to hear arguments for the faith. As Pete was saying, they want to see it embodied. People are moved. Pope Benedict said that the greatest arguments for the church today, for the faith today, are the art the church produces and the saints it produces. In other words, the beauty and the goodness that come out of the Christian faith, those are the gateways to truth, ultimately, and to conversion. I think that we are called today to live in truth as we know it and let our lives be an evangelical witness to the world and to the validity and the goodness of the way of life that Christ gives us.
We'll take one last question, and we'd like a question that is addressed to all of our panelists, and we'll have hopefully quick answers, and then we'll wrap this up. So only raise your hand if you have a question for all three folks. Okay, I see one right back there.
This may be kind of an odd question, but it is to all of you. So you communicated that when reading through the book, you both found an appreciation for what Rod had to offer. And my question was, in reading through it, were there liturgies or rituals that you felt would have been would be today very helpful for you to take on to be formative in your Christian development, your Christian faith? So for all three of you.
Start with Rob. You want to go first?
Oh, well, we're in Lent right now, great Lent for Eastern Orthodox Christians and for Catholics too, and others who observe Lent. And for Orthodox Christians, Eastern Orthodox Christians, that means denying yourself meat and dairy, generally speaking. The fast is not a legalistic thing, but it's to remind ourselves that we depend on the Word of God, not just our physical desires. And so the fasting, which used to be a universal Christian practice until fairly recently in history, it is not about trying to earn merit or anything, but it's only about reordering our lives to put our body's desires, to make them subject to the Spirit, to the Lord. So I would say that fasting has been one of the ways that has helped me grow spiritually in tremendous ways over the last 10 years of being an Orthodox Christian. It seems kind of crazy in this society today, but when you realize how much we are driven by our desires, whether it's desire for food, desire for sex, desire for the internet, that's my big cross, constantly, no, I'm just going to check my email here. I can't stand for 1 minute in a line at the grocery store without checking Twitter. That is something that rules me. That is a passion that rules me. Fasting is about training ourselves not to be ruled by our passions, but only by what God asks of us. So fasting is what I would recommend to people as a great way to start.
Is the question about what we saw in the book about, or I didn't totally understand it, or is it just
You can
generally?
take it any direction you want,
Any
Kristen.
direction, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I do think even the book did prompt me to think more about fasting, because that is something that you talk about and something that I don't do enough. And, but I think that it, just talking about all the various spiritual disciplines and then the way that you look at these different communities and different people who've really integrated this into their life and the sort of, power that comes from that, I think, what you're talking about basically, which is really staying centered on God and how important these kinds of, these disciplines really are. It's something I already know, but it's something that I felt the book was good at sort of reminding me of, and again, through showing me how it's impacted in certain individuals.
I should say I've done fasting in my life, but to show you how wayward my heart is, it's when I felt like I needed to lose weight. So I tried to do two birds with one stone and just tell people I was fasting for spiritual reasons. But now I've confessed. So
When you're fasting.
what's that?
Not supposed to tell people when you're fasting.
Yeah, I guess that's right. That's right. But I'm not now. I think there is. I agree. There's a lot about the disciplines, and a lot has been written about the Christian disciplines, everything from prayer to Bible reading to fasting and other things. I just will say, just on a personal experience, and maybe it's partly because of you go through different seasons in your life, the things that have probably moved me the most recently and helped me the most is actually music. My pilgrimage to Christianity was one that was not easy. I was a person that dealt with questions and doubts at the beginning of my faith, and to this day, anybody that knows me and communicates with me in this realm knows that's to be true. And what I've found is that music is actually the only real thing, or the most powerful thing, that transports me out of that. Somehow, as I've gotten older, it's given me a level of I think, communion with God, in which I just kind of feel like the doubts and the questions begin to drop away. And I don't know, I can't sing worth a lick, but there's something about the power of music, which I think, Rod, you kind of deal with, sort of the good, the beautiful, the deeper things of life. But you know, if you would have asked me 20 years ago, I probably would have given you a different answer. So I say we all go through kind of seasons in our life, and we have to figure out at any particular moment in life, what are the things that sustain us? And that can be one thing. And again, just to underscore another point that we talked about, is I think other people can sustain us. There's a line that Kirsten used about Paul saying, an ambassador to Christ. There have been just too many times in my life where God has seemed distant and opaque and beyond reach. And it's at that time that other people have helped me to either see that or themselves have been proxies for that. And that's an immeasurable gift.
Thank you. Ready to add a very short concluding thought?
Very short concluding thought. This is something I want every Christian in this room to take away, whatever your faith tradition. Many of you know that I was a Roman Catholic for a while, lost my faith in a very painful way through writing about the sexual abuse scandal. I'm so grateful to God that He allowed me to be broken in my own intellectual pride and pull me into the Orthodox Church. I didn't do that thinking I was joining a perfect church at all, but the problem was not so much with the Catholic Church, but with me and my own pride. I remember when I was a young man in my 20s coming into the Catholic Church, I was so excited about the Catholic faith. A woman at my job said, "Oh, you want to be a Catholic? I'm a Catholic. Come with me to the Missionaries of Charity soup kitchen this weekend. Let's work." Well, I said, "Oh, that's wonderful. That seems very Catholic." I went there. I scrubbed pots and I peeled potatoes that Saturday afternoon. And when it was over with, I said, "Well, that was all wonderful, but I'm really more of an intellectual. My time would be better spent reading books of theology." And that's what I did. I never went back to the soup kitchen. And I was very militantly I was Team Newhouse all the way, a very political Catholic. Years later, 13 years later or so, when my Catholic faith was in ruins because of the abuse scandal, I reflected on the decision I made not to go back to the soup kitchen. If I had not been so caught up in my head in thinking that the life of faith was about reason and syllogisms and books of theology, if I had put that theology into practice by working with my hands and serving, my Catholic faith might have survived. It's true if you're an Eastern Orthodox Christian or a Protestant or anything, you've got to do something with your hands. You've got to form the heart, because as Thomas Merton knew, your conversion is always precarious if it's only in your head, if it's not in your heart, rooted in your heart.
And on that note. Rod's book, just published yesterday, will be for sale just outside those doors. Rod will be signing copies that are sold, so definitely avail yourself of that. We highly recommend it. We also highly recommend taking advantage of an invitation that should be on each of your chairs to join the Trinity Forum Society. As you may have gathered from these evenings, we try to provide a space for thoughtful professionals to grapple with what matters most, and against a distracted, uncivil, often belligerent culture, we try to provide a place that is both warmly hospitable and intellectually rigorous to grapple with the warm questions of life. The big questions of life. Your membership helps make that possible, not only tonight, but other events as well. And we would love to welcome you as a member of the Trinity Forum Society. As an added incentive, for the first 10 people who join the Trinity Forum Society tonight, you can avoid the line out there and get your own signed copy of Rod's book, lickety-split, going right on through. There are also other advantages to joining the Trinity Forum Society. You get a daily, what we're reading, curated list of reading recommendations. monthly podcasts with thought leaders such as Rod, Kirsten, and Pete, as well as our quarterly readings, where we take great pieces of literature and letters that should be more familiar to many thoughtful professionals, add discussion questions at the back, so they're essentially a book club in a bag. This one, with different selections from Dante's Divine Comedy, features an introduction by Rod. So we encourage you to avail yourself of that as well. We'd also love for you to join us for future evening conversations here in DC. Our next one in DC, invitations will be going out on Friday, will be held on April 12th, will be held in partnership with Duke Divinity School, and will be on the topic of faith, health, and healing. We'd love to see you there. Finally, it is always appropriate to end with thanks, and none of these events happen without us owing thanks to many people. So I'd like to simply thank our sponsors, the Pepperdine School of Public Policy, ably, very talentedly led by their dean, Pete Peterson, whose vision and support have made not only this evening possible, but this ongoing series that has lasted for 5 years. We are deeply indebted. Also just want to thank our volunteers, Cliff Smith from Pepperdine, Hannah Wolf, Susanna Brister, Lizzie McClanahan, our fabulous interns emeriti, Carrie Lucas and Nancy Ritter, who came back for the evening, photographer Zach Miller, my own Crackerjack colleagues, Colleen O'Malley, Alyssa Abraham, Ashley White Brothers, John Huff, and Ryan Bolton. Finally, thank you also to our speakers for this rich, thick discussion. Much to be gained, much to ponder and chew on. We really appreciate the obvious thought as well as grace that went into it. Finally, thank you to all of you for coming, and good night.